On February 2nd, 2026, a town in Sicily watched the ground beneath it begin to erase the future in real time. Behind evacuation barriers outside Nuskei, residents stood frozen as a 3-story building that had survived for more than a century suddenly tore itself apart. At exactly 2:47 p.m., its eastern wall split away from the structure and dropped into the widening void below. No warning cracks, no slow settling, no time to react. In under 30 seconds, a family home became rubble. And this was not an isolated collapse. It was the 4th major structural failure in just 48 hours. Seismic instruments positioned around the failure zone recorded low-frequency tremors every 6 to 18 hours, each one aligning with moments when more ground gave way. But what makes this disaster unprecedented is that it is not slowing down, it is accelerating. Between January 25th, when the main landslide activated, and February 2nd, the failure zone expanded from an initial scarp 1.6 kilometers wide to more than 5 kilometers across. The plateau edge has retreated inland by an estimated 50 to 70 meters in less than 2 weeks. More than 1,300 people remain displaced, and entire neighborhoods that showed no visible distress just days ago now sit inside the official red zone, declared too dangerous for occupation. Officials are now admitting what no community wants to hear. They cannot predict where this will stop. Civil Protection Director Salvo Cattina said on February 1st, "We cannot predict where the retrogressive failure will stop. Every building within 50 to 70 meters of the current edge is at imminent risk, but the seismic signals suggest the instability extends much deeper into the town. We may need to expand evacuations again." So what is happening in Nuskei? Is this simply a tragic landslide that will stabilize once the most unstable material has moved? Or did Cyclone Harry's extreme rainfall trigger something far more dangerous, a geological cascade that will continue consuming the town until the plateau retreats to stable bedrock or flatter terrain? Because what is unfolding here is not a single collapse. It is a process. To understand why Nuskei's buildings continue failing, you need to understand the mechanism of retrogressive plateau edge collapse, and why every collapse makes the next one more likely, not less. Nuskei sits atop an elevated plateau in Sicily's interior, a flat-topped landform bounded by steep slopes descending into surrounding valleys. It exists because erosion-resistant caprock overlies weaker clay-rich sedimentary layers. Over thousands of years, rivers and streams have slowly eroded the softer material at the plateau edges, carving steep scarps. The caprock, relatively competent sandstone or limestone, cantilevers over the clay below, forming the vertical cliffs that define the plateau boundary. But this geometry is inherently unstable. The caprock loses support as the underlying clay weakens and erodes. Tension cracks develop parallel to the cliff edge. Eventually, blocks fail, dropping vertically or rotating backward as they slide along curved failure surfaces in the clay beneath. And here's the terrifying part. When one block collapses, it removes lateral support from the next section of edge, creating a new unstable boundary. Each failure becomes the starting point for the next. Geologists call this retrogressive failure, a collapse that propagates backward inland, step by step, consuming land as it goes. For centuries, Nuskei's plateau edge eroded slowly enough that communities developed. Buildings stood for generations. Small collapses occurred, but never at a frequency suggesting systemic failure. Then Cyclone Harry transformed the system from marginally unstable into catastrophically collapsing. Between January 12th and January 17th, 2026, Cyclone Harry, a rare Mediterranean tropical-like cyclone, stalled over Sicily and produced rainfall totals beyond modern records. Some areas received 300 millimeters, nearly 12 inches, in just 48 hours. Winds exceeded 150 kilometers per hour. Seas between Sicily and Malta reached historic extremes, with buoys recording waves approaching 16 meters high. But the true danger was not what happened above ground. The rain infiltrated deep into the clay-rich layers beneath Nuskei's plateau. Clay minerals common in Sicilian formations have extraordinary water absorption capacity. As water enters, the clays expand. Pore pressure rises, and the bonds between particles weaken. The material's shear strength drops dramatically. Engineering studies of similar formations show saturation can reduce shear strength by 50 to 70%. Material that could support heavy loads when dry becomes unable to resist even modest stresses when wet. Slopes that held for centuries begin failing, and the first sign appeared on January 16th, when cracks opened in Provincial Road 12, running parallel to the plateau edge roughly 100 to 150 meters inland. Pavement showed tension fractures indicating the ground was pulling apart. These were not surface defects. They signaled deep-seated movement. the clay layers deforming beneath the caprock. Mayor Maximiliano Key ordered evacuation of 35 residents on January 17th and closed schools in the most threatened zone. Civil protection teams deployed GPS stations to measure displacement, visual surveys to track crack growth, and warnings urging residents to remain alert. But monitoring could not predict what happened next. On Sunday, January 25th, at approximately 1 p.m., the slow deformation suddenly accelerated into catastrophic failure. Witnesses described not a sharp crash, but a deep grinding rumble that lasted minutes. Then the ground gave way along a front stretching nearly 4 kilometers. A scarp opened, an abrupt vertical drop 15 to 20 meters high. Entire neighborhoods that had been on relatively flat ground suddenly found themselves at the edge of a cliff. Homes once 50 to 100 meters from the plateau margin were now within meters of a 20-meter void. Support vanished beneath buildings, roads, and utilities. Over 1,300 people were evacuated, many given only minutes to gather essentials. Families watched from barriers as their homes hung precariously over the new edge, unsure whether they would survive hours, days, or collapse without warning. The January 25th failure was traumatic, but what followed revealed the truly insidious nature of retrogressive collapse. On January 31st, a 3-story building about 40 meters from the edge suddenly collapsed. Drone footage captured the moment. The structure appeared intact, then within seconds separated vertically, one section tumbling into the void while the remainder tilted precariously. The collapse followed additional rainfall, not as extreme as Cyclone Harry, but enough to resaturate clays that had partially drained. February 1st brought 2 more structural failures. Buildings that had seemed stable the day before simply disintegrated as the ground beneath them continued creeping. By February 2nd, when the 4th major collapse occurred at 2:47 p.m., seismologists detected a disturbing pattern. The failures were not random. They were part of a continuing sequence. Dr. Alejandro Bonforte of Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology analyzed seismic records from January 25th through February 2nd. Every 6 to 18 hours, instruments recorded bursts of seismic energy consistent with large-scale deformation and collapse. The timing matched the observed structural failures. The subsurface clay layers were failing progressively. Each collapse redistributed stress through the unstable mass, triggering the next failure. The ground was failing in stages, each stage setting up the next. And this meant the process would not stop simply because material had moved. As long as unstable clay remained beneath the plateau edge, retrogressive failure would continue propagating inland, consuming buildings, roads, and land in a process monitoring could document, but intervention could not prevent. The consequences have now cascaded through every system built on the assumption of stability. The Angelo Marciano Library, containing roughly 4,000 historical texts about Sicilian history, sits inside the red zone. Evacuating the collection is difficult because access roads themselves may collapse. Officials face impossible decisions: risk lives for irreplaceable heritage or accept the loss of centuries of documented history. 5 schools remain closed. Over 800 students are displaced. Temporary arrangements are being implemented, but the disruption affects education, childcare, family routines, and community cohesion. Infrastructure failures compound the crisis. Provincial roads. 10 and 12 are destroyed or impassable. Road 11 remains the sole access route for approximately 25,000 people in the region. If it becomes compromised, entire communities could be isolated from emergency services and supply chains. Utilities have been shut off in the red zone to prevent secondary disasters. Even if some areas stabilize, restoring services would require enormous investment in infrastructure that may need to be abandoned again if collapse resumes. Economic devastation extends far beyond property loss. Governor Renato Schifani estimated damages could reach 1.5 billion euros when accounting for destroyed infrastructure, business interruption, and long-term impacts. Insurance companies are withdrawing coverage not only within the red zone but across areas deemed long-term landslide risk. Homeowners now face financial ruin with mortgages on properties that may become uninsurable and uninhabitable. The psychological toll on displaced residents is profound. Unlike disasters that strike and end, this one continues. Each day brings news of another collapse, another expansion of the danger zone, another set of homes condemned. Residents exist in a suspended crisis, unsure whether they will ever return or whether the town they have known will continue to exist. Civil protection measures have prevented loss of life. Monitoring and evacuation have saved people, but none of it stops the geological process. Engineering interventions that might stabilize other landslides are impractical at this scale. Retaining structures cannot support an entire plateau edge. Drainage systems cannot be installed in actively failing ground. Reinforcement techniques do not work when failure surfaces lie 20 to 40 meters deep across kilometers. The most viable option emerging from technical assessments is managed abandonment. Recognizing that portions of Nuskei sit atop ground that cannot be stabilized at acceptable cost, authorities may have to facilitate relocation and long-term support. This is an extraordinary admission for a community that has existed for centuries, that the location itself has become untenable. But even abandonment raises impossible questions. Where do 1,300 displaced residents go? How are they compensated when property values have collapsed and insurance will not cover losses? What happens to identity and social fabric when significant portions of a town must be surrendered? Italy has declared a 12-month state of emergency for Sicily, Sardinia, and Calabria, enabling access to national emergency funds. But emergency funding addresses immediate needs, not comprehensive relocation and long-term compensation. The broader context reveals why Nuskei may be a preview of challenges facing communities across the Mediterranean. Sicily contains many areas with similar geology: clay-rich formations, plateau edges, villages developed near unstable scarps. Climate projections suggest Mediterranean cyclones like Harry may become more frequent and intense. Extreme rainfall means more saturation of marginal slopes, more landslide triggers, and more communities facing scenarios like Nuskei. Italy's landslide inventory documents over 620,000 known landslides, the highest in Europe. Millions live in susceptible zones. Stabilizing every at-risk area would cost hundreds of billions of euros, an investment governments cannot provide. But allowing communities to remain creates cycles of disaster, emergency response, partial mitigation, and renewed collapse when the next extreme event arrives. Today, collapses at Nuskei continue. Buildings identified as at risk may fail tomorrow or next week as movement progresses. Seismic monitoring shows no sign of deceleration. The red zone may expand again. Systems built for habitation assume stability on human timescales. They did not account for extreme weather accelerating centuries of erosion into days of catastrophic failure. Tonight, seismometers continue recording tremors. Drones continue surveying the edge. Civil protection officials prepare for additional evacuations. Residents wait behind barriers, watching their town approach the void. Somewhere beneath Nuskei, in saturated clay layers 20 to 40 meters below the surface, the subsurface continues its slow deformation. Support vanishes block by block, creating the conditions for the next collapse. And until the plateau retreats to terrain where geology finally allows stability, the sequence will continue. Because Nuskei is not just collapsing, it is revealing something far more terrifying: that the ground we build on is only as stable as the climate allows it to be.